Now, Donald Trump's history of strong support for Israel and intense pressure on Iran, coupled with his insistence during the campaign that the war in Gaza should end quickly, raise so many questions over how his second presidency will affect the region. A region in a very much pivotal moment. Here at France 24, Emerald Maxwell has this.
They said, he will start a war. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
Donald Trump says he will end the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, but he did not specify during his campaign how he would approach it, nor has he outlined a clear vision for post-war Gaza. During his first presidential term, he led perhaps the most pro-Israel policy of any US administration, endorsing Israeli settlements in the West Bank, recognizing its sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and Jerusalem as Israel's capital. All barriers to peace with Palestine. But once close, Trump's relationship with Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu is not what it once was.
I think Trump now, he has different calculation. He never forget that Netanyahu disregarded him for months when he was weak, when he was under investigation and everything. Netanyahu sees an opportunity, but the dynamics have changed compared to 4 years ago.
Another big question is how Trump will approach Iran. Tehran was in Trump's crosshairs during his first administration. He unilaterally withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear deal and imposed a maximum pressure policy on the country, with harsh sanctions crippling its economy. A second term could mean more hardship for Iran at a pivotal time. For now, the Iranian regime is playing down that possibility.
Right now, the country isn't overly concerned about Trump winning. Today, Iran's economy has the capacity to withstand these challenges.
Relations between the US and Saudi Arabia flourished during Trump's first term, bonded over their shared foe, Iran. Trump could now push for normalization of relations between the kingdom and Israel by expanding the Abraham Accords, which he presided over, that saw Israel normalize relations with 4 other Arab states. Since then, though, the regional dynamics have changed. Riyadh and Tehran have entered a new chapter of détente, while Saudi Arabia has also grown closer to China.
Emerald Maxwell setting up here our guest, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who's resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who's been living and breathing this story over the past 24, 48 hours and perhaps beyond. Ahmed, thanks for being with us here at France 24. We appreciate your presence most of all. What is your sense of what Donald Trump means for the Middle East?
Well, certainly Trump is highly unpredictable as a person. Nevertheless, we expect that this will be a Trump 2.0 presidency, such that he's going to build upon some of the experiences he's had in his first term. I think we can expect some kind of an evolution to the conflict when it comes to the war in Gaza. He's pledged to stop it. He, I think, is going to place immense pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to wrap it up such that by the time he's inaugurated on January 20th, the conflict is over. The million-dollar question is, what's the price? What's the carrot that he's going to offer Netanyahu in exchange for pausing the war? And that likely may entail some form of annexation of the West Bank being accepted and tolerated by the United States as a matter of policy.
Indeed, that annexation, of course, wouldn't be tolerated by Palestinians who are there. That's one big sticking point. Another issue, of course, is that Joe Biden has been a real staunch supporter and backer of Israel so far, even as Netanyahu was speaking out in favor of Trump, ironically. Is it likely that Trump's support for Israel will be less strong than that of Biden?
Well, on the one hand, Trump is interested in calming down these regional wars, and that may conflict with Netanyahu's desires to get the United States involved in striking Iran, both as revenge for October 7 and supporting all these proxies, but also to weaken Tehran's nuclear program. On the other hand, we expect that Mr. Trump is going to be tough on Iran precisely because of his past experiences with them. He feels strongly that he deterred Iran and that Mr. Biden had failed to do so. And we also discovered the alleged intelligence assessments claiming Iran tried to assassinate Mr. Trump, or at least some senior members of his cabinet. So that is going to guide his presidency. That is going to play a major role. I don't expect Mr. Trump is going to be less staunch of a supporter of Israel. On the other hand, I also think that he has a vendetta with Mr. Netanyahu. He doesn't like him personally. He doesn't like that Netanyahu didn't stand by him when he claimed that the elections were stolen in 2020. Lastly, we also know that this is his final term as president, and that may very well drive a hard bargain when it comes to his negotiations with the Israelis.
That issue of annexation of the West Bank, this is something that obviously will cause big problems in UN circles too, because the behavior of settlers, Israeli settlers, or you might call them trespassers in another context, setting up their homes there illegally. It's something that has brought lots of people internationally out saying that this must be stopped. There should be an end to it. Is this going to be a big issue going forward, do you think, if Trump says, yes, go ahead, annex part of the West Bank?
Well, it depends on who he brings on board as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. If it's going to be David Friedman, which is a very highly likely possibility based on the current assessments, that's going to be a serious problem for the Palestinians in the sense that David Friedman published a book this year called One Jewish State, in which he openly and clearly and overtly celebrates, not just calls for it, but celebrates the annexation of the West Bank as being the only realistic and pragmatic way forward. This is going to be a disaster for the Palestinian Authority. We expect that if Mr. Friedman pushes in that direction, that's going to be coupled by the cutting off of U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority, to UNRWA. We expect that this could trigger a potential third intifada of a sort. The Palestinian Authority is no longer going to have an incentive to coordinate with Israel on security issues to prevent Palestinian attacks against settlers. Furthermore, I think this is going to cause a big issue with the main winners, I think, of Trump's presidency at this point are the Saudis, who want a mutual defense treaty with the United States, and a Republican-controlled Congress is going to be able to codify that so that it's not subject to revocation by an incoming future administration. However, the Saudis made it clear that there needs to be an irreversible pathway towards Palestinian statehood to normalize relationships with Israel and achieve that mutual defense treaty.
And that is a real sticking point, isn't it? That sort of real difference there, which is something that has not been crossed since Israel was established, the idea that there should be a Palestinian state. Can I just park that there and talk a bit about Gaza, and in particular, that plan that was published by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, for an economic development of the Gaza Strip, which looked great on paper in terms of turning it into a kind of Dubai for the Gaza Strip in that kind of sense. Singapore, he suggested, for the West Bank. But again, that plan, economic plan, perhaps you could see how Kushner, Trump might gain from that in terms of investment. What about the Palestinian people? Once again, we're left thinking, what is in it for them? What is their future? How do they control their future going forward?
Well, I'm a major proponent of economic development for the Palestinian people, and I've been highly critical.
Would this plan work, do you think?
Well, on the one hand, we know that there needs to be economic sustainability and development because Gaza's unfortunately under Hamas has become aid dependent. On the other hand, we also know that economic peace alone cannot achieve the aspirations of Palestinian people, the Palestinian people, for independence, for freedom, for self-determination.
And that thing about freedom of movement is a big problem, isn't it? Because they can't freely travel to and from their territories, can they?
Precisely that. And one of the issues that I've always promoted is a non-Israeli and a non-Egyptian access point, leveraging Gaza's position over the Mediterranean via an airport and a seaport. I think Gaza's development is entirely attainable. And I genuinely believe that this very likely could be Gaza's last war. And especially if this ceasefire and hostage deal are coupled with political transformation in terms of governance, in terms of Gaza no longer being a resistance platform, but instead being the crown jewel of the Palestinian people, being the pride and joy, the beating heart of a future Palestinian state. But once again, economic peace alone, which the last deal of the century that Mr. Trump and Jared Kushner promoted, it reeked of economic economic development that is separated from political rights and political freedoms and a sense of independence and sovereignty and national identity, that will only temporarily forestall future conflict if it is not coupled with political progress.
Those rights for the Palestinian people have to be central, don't they? Then that comes to the idea of the two-state solution, not Palestinians living in, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, an idea published which involved British mercenaries, gated communities, which, if you read between the lines, one could say it sounded more like internment camps rather than gated communities. That is no real future development to give a flourishing Palestinian statehood or even flourishing Palestinian individual lives, is it?
And that's where the policies of Prime Minister Netanyahu have been particularly nefarious in the Gaza Strip, in the conduct of this war, in the West Bank, even prior to this war, when he used Hamas's control of Gaza to play off the Palestinians against each other, to keep them divided. I still maintain that the two-state solution, regardless of its final borders, as a concept, is the only viable path forward in which you have two people with their own space, with separation. After all this trauma, we need two distinct spaces. And the two-state solution, and this is what I've been calling the Palestinian leadership and other pragmatic Palestinian leaders, to understand that there may need to be a transitional period that requires phases to achieve the two-state solution. It might start with limited sovereignty. It might start with limited territories. And I understand the Israeli security concerns, particularly in the wake of October 7. But at the end of the day, no matter the borders, the two-state solution cannot be dispensed for Israel's own security and longevity and being integrated in the region. Certainly for the Palestinian people's long-term interests in having a space that they can call a state and being a part of Israel's integration in the region. I support the Abraham Accords, but bypassing the Palestinians is not a sustainable strategy. And in that regard, I think the Saudis are going to be interesting to look at and to watch out for, because Mohammed bin Salman and the promise that he made to not have normalization with Israel without Palestinian statehood may very well be the Palestinian people's last hope to achieve the two-state solution.
And of course, that statement from Mohammed bin Salman is extremely important, that he is for Palestinian statehood in some way, shape or form, a definite place which is a Palestinian homeland. That is something he's 100% for. Trump's position then, one has the impression that that could ebb, flow, that could change how it sort of seems to him on any given day. Nonetheless, he's going to want his deal, his cut of something. That's the way he operates. So what do you think he's looking for?
I honestly think he's looking for legacy. I think he's looking to prove that his unpredictability is a successful form of foreign policy. I also think he's looking out for his own interests potentially, though I will say at his age, and I mean, he's achieved financial greatness. He's achieved, he's obtained the most powerful position that one could hope for in the world. I genuinely think he's going to be driven by ego and legacy, and that will potentially entail him wanting to prove that he solved something that no other American leader, indeed world leader, could address. But I also think he's subject to manipulation by those who are around him. And I worry about the team that he's going to surround himself by, not just the U.S. ambassador, but a host of advisors. We've seen the hollowing out of the State Department during his tenure, where a lot of policies and files were concentrated in the White House, in his inner circle. And that's essentially locked out a lot of the career professionals.
Because the sort of five-star generals, if you like, think of the military things, who would be with him, who were with him in the previous mandate, of course, they've all turned against him now. There is a different kind of advisor around him. This could be a very nefarious move.
Precisely that. And this could be a very politically driven move that isolates the professionals, both in the State Department, Department of Defense, military experts. We've seen some of the more conservative think tanks kind of trying to build up excitement around certain programs that they want to get in front of Mr. Trump. There's a belief that he's going to be a bit more cautious about who he chooses to surround himself with. But again, that's one set of considerations. The other set is what the Saudis and what the Emiratis and what the Palestinians come up with as a cohesive, unified vision, a unified front to deal with Mr. Trump.
Ahmed, you've spoken to the relevant Palestinians, do they trust Trump? Do they feel that this is someone that they can work with?
On the one hand, absolutely not. They do not after the last administration. On the other hand, there's very much so a pragmatic realization that the Biden administration and potentially a Harris administration could have been a continuation of Biden's inert policies that are lackluster, that are inadequate, that there could be an opportunity to break the stalemate, and that only somebody as bombastic and as unpredictable and as ferocious as Mr. Trump could take on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's likely to remain in power for the foreseeable future. What really concerns me is what happens in the next 2.5 months. If Mr. Biden somehow escalates towards Netanyahu, and we have that 30-day deadline approaching from that letter that the State Department and Department of Defense sent to the Israelis, warning about consequences to foreign aid if conditions in Gaza aren't addressed, will Mr. Biden escalate with the Israelis and withhold some of the offensive munitions or withhold some of the foreign aid? If he does so, that could, in a sense, tie Trump's hands, forcing him to come in bombastically as the pro-Israel president on January 20th. So that may inadvertently actually reduce the likelihood of meaningful action that could stop the wars in Gaza, potentially in Lebanon. So that's what I think we should all be looking for in the next 2.5 months.
Ahmed, when you came in, I said humorously that we could have an hour chatting, and I really mean we could have had an hour chatting, but sadly, time has moved on, and we need to move on with the news. Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you for coming here and sharing your insight into what is one of the most important stories at the moment, what's happening in the Middle East. And of course, Donald Trump, newly elected as president of the US, will have a large voice in what happens next. Thank you, sir, for joining us here at France 24. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we'll turn to the situation